The leather strap came down hard across Penelope Zimmerman's face, and when she finally lifted her head from the dirt, she heard the metallic scrape of shears opening beside her ear. Her aunt's voice was cold as winter steel when she said those terrible words that would change everything. "Since you want to act like a common saloon girl, you'll look like one too." Montana City sprawled across the dusty valley like a collection of matchboxes someone had scattered and forgotten to pick up. The year was 1876, and the town had seen better days before the silver mine started showing signs of running dry. Penelope had lived here all her 21 years, the last 3 under the iron rule of her Aunt Gertrude, after both her parents succumbed to scarlet fever during one brutal winter. Those 3 years felt longer than all the others combined. The shears made their terrible music, chunk after chunk of auburn hair falling to the ground like autumn leaves. Penelope kept her eyes squeezed shut, tears streaming down her cheeks, mingling with the dust on her face. Her crime had been simple: speaking to a man without a chaperone. The man in question had been asking directions to the telegraph office, nothing more, but Aunt Gertrude had seen them from the mercantile window and deemed it an unforgivable transgression. When the cutting finally stopped, Penelope's hair hung in jagged chunks around her jaw, uneven and shameful. Aunt Gertrude stepped back, surveying her handiwork with grim satisfaction. "Maybe now you'll remember your place," she said before turning on her heel and marching back into the house, leaving Penelope kneeling in the yard. The sun beat down mercilessly as Penelope finally rose to her feet, her legs trembling. She could feel the lightness around her head, the absence of the long braid she had worn since childhood. Her fingers came up automatically to touch what remained, and fresh tears burned her eyes. She had to get away from here, even if only for a few hours. The thought of sitting at the dinner table while her aunt looked at her with that triumphant expression made her stomach turn. She grabbed the water pail as an excuse and headed toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and she kept her head down, praying she would not encounter anyone she knew. The July heat pressed against her like a physical thing, making her cotton dress cling to her back. The creek was little more than a trickle this time of year, but the cottonwood trees that lined its banks provided blessed shade. Penelope sank down onto a flat rock and finally allowed herself to look at her reflection in the sluggish water. The face that stared back looked like a stranger's. Her hair stuck out at odd angles, longer on one side than the other, choppy and uneven. She looked like someone who had been marked, punished, shamed. That is some rough barbering. Penelope's head snapped up so fast her neck cracked. A man stood about 10 feet away, leading a paint horse by its reins. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty work clothes and a battered hat that had seen better days. His face was shadowed beneath the brim, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "I did not hear you approach," Penelope said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. She stood quickly, instinctively turning her face away. "Did not mean to startle you," the man said, his voice gentle. He had a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Oklahoma. "My horse needed water." "Name is Zachary Zinc." Despite her embarrassment, good manners won out. "Penelope Zimmerman." Zachary led his horse to the creek and let it drink while he studied her with eyes that were remarkably blue against his sun-darkened skin. He could not have been much older than she was, maybe 25 at most. There was something kind in his face, something that made her not immediately flee despite her humiliation. "Someone do that to you?" he asked, nodding toward her hair. Penelope's hand flew up to touch the ragged ends. "It is not your concern." "Maybe not," Zachary agreed, "but it does not seem right is all I am saying." He pulled his hat off and ran a hand through his own dark hair. "I have done some trail barbering for the ranch hands. Not fancy, but I could even it out for you if you wanted. Make it look more intentional like." "Why would you do that?" Penelope asked suspiciously. In her experience, men did not offer kindness without expecting something in return. Zachary shrugged, his expression earnest. "Because you look like you could use a kindness right now, and it is no trouble to me." He pulled a small leather kit from his saddlebag and held it up. "I have proper scissors in here. Keep them sharp for mending tack and such." Penelope hesitated. Every lesson Aunt Gertrude had tried to beat into her said she should run. That speaking to a strange man was exactly what had gotten her into this mess in the first place. But another part of her, a part that was tired of being small and afraid, made her nod slowly. "All right," she said quietly. Zachary smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. "Come, sit here in the light where I can see what I am doing." She settled back onto the rock while he retrieved his scissors and positioned himself behind her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his fingers touched her hair gently, almost reverently, assessing the damage. "Who did this to you?" he asked softly. "My aunt, as punishment." The words came out flat, but underneath them was an ocean of hurt. Zachary's hand stilled for a moment. "That is not right. Cutting someone's hair like this, it is meant to shame. You did not deserve that, whatever she thought you did." Penelope felt her throat tighten with emotion. No one had told her she did not deserve it. No one had suggested that maybe her aunt was wrong. The scissors began their work, and this time the sound was different, careful, precise. Zachary worked slowly, evening out the lengths, shaping what remained into something deliberate. His hands were gentle but sure, never pulling or tugging unnecessarily. "I work at the Double Z Ranch about 5 miles north of here," he said as he worked, his voice conversational. "Been there about 2 years now. It is a good outfit. The owner, Mr. Rutherford, treats his people fair." "I have heard of it," Penelope said. "They come into town for supplies sometimes." "That is how I know Montana City. Came in today to pick up some medication for one of the horses. She has been favoring her left front leg." He snipped carefully around her ear. "What do you do here in town?" "Nothing much," Penelope admitted. "I keep house for my aunt. Cook, clean, tend the garden, the usual things." Sounds lonely. It was such a simple observation, but it struck straight to her heart. "Yes," she whispered. "It is." They fell into a comfortable silence while Zachary continued his work. Penelope could hear the creek trickling, birds calling in the trees, the occasional stamp of the horses' hooves. The tension that had been coiled tight in her chest since the shearing began to slowly unwind. "There," Zachary said finally, stepping back. "Take a look." Penelope leaned over the water again, and this time the face that looked back was still changed, but in a completely different way. Her hair now fell in soft, even layers that just brushed her jawline, shorter in the back and slightly longer in the front. It framed her face in a way her long braid never had, highlighting her high cheekbones and making her green eyes seem larger and more luminous. "It frames your beautiful face perfectly now," Zachary said quietly. Penelope turned to look at him, heat flooding her cheeks. No one had ever called her beautiful before. Pretty, perhaps, in the distant way relatives acknowledged such things, but never beautiful, and never with such genuine warmth in their voice. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Truly, you did not have to do this. I wanted to." Zachary tucked his scissors back into his kit and secured it to his saddle. "Listen, I come into town most Saturdays to pick up supplies and check the mail. If you ever wanted to talk or needed anything, I am usually at the Mercantile around mid-morning." Penelope knew she should say no, should tell him it was impossible, that her aunt would never allow it. But instead she found herself nodding. "I would like that." His smile returned, bright and warm as summer sunshine. "Good, that is real good." He swung up into his saddle with easy grace. "You take care now, Miss Penelope." "You too, Mr. Zink." "Zachary," he corrected. "Just Zachary." "Penelope," she replied. "Just Penelope." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and turned his horse back toward the road. Penelope watched him go until he disappeared around the bend, then sat back down on her rock and stared at her reflection again. The face looking back at her seemed different now, not just because of the hair, but because of something else, something like hope. The walk back to her aunt's house felt both too short and too long. Penelope knew there would be consequences for staying away so long, but she found she did not care as much as she once would have. The memory of Zachary's kindness, the gentleness of his hands, the way he had looked at her like she mattered, all of it formed a small, warm ember of defiance in her chest. Aunt Gertrude was waiting on the porch, her thin face pinched with displeasure. "Where have you been? Supper needs preparing." "I went to the creek," Penelope said, climbing the steps. She kept her head up this time, meeting her aunt's eyes directly. Gertrude's gaze raked over her newly styled hair, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. The ragged punishment she had inflicted now looked almost fashionable, and clearly, that had not been her intention. "Get inside and start the potatoes," was all she said, but her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. That night, lying in her narrow bed under the eaves, Penelope touched her hair and thought about Zachary. She thought about his kind eyes and gentle hands, the way he had seen her pain and chosen to help without asking for anything in return. She thought about Saturday, still 5 days away, and wondered if he had really meant it about meeting at the mercantile. The next morning, Penelope woke before dawn as always and started her daily routine. But as she moved through the familiar tasks of building the fire, making breakfast, and sweeping the floors, she found herself humming. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt significant nonetheless. At the mercantile that afternoon, picking up flour and beans, Mrs. Henderson behind the counter did a double take when she saw Penelope's hair. "Well now, that is quite a change," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Penelope agreed, refusing to elaborate. "It suits you," Mrs. Henderson said finally, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "Makes you look more grown-up somehow." Penelope felt a flush of pleasure. "Thank you." As she walked home with her basket, several other townspeople took notice. Some looked shocked, others curious, but nobody said anything cruel. Perhaps because the cut actually looked good, or perhaps because Penelope carried herself differently now, with her shoulders back and her head high. The days crawled toward Saturday with agonizing slowness. Penelope went through her routines mechanically, her mind always partially elsewhere, wondering if Zachary had been serious, if he would really be there, if she had imagined the connection she had felt between them. Friday evening, Aunt Gertrude announced she would be spending Saturday morning at the church ladies' auxiliary meeting. "You will stay here and finish the mending," she instructed. "There is a pile of linens that need attention." "Yes, Aunt," Penelope said meekly. But inside, her mind was already working. The church was on the opposite end of town from the mercantile. If she was quick, if she was careful, she might be able to slip out for just a little while. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Penelope served breakfast, cleaned the dishes, and waited with barely contained impatience while Aunt Gertrude prepared for her meeting. The moment her aunt's stiff figure disappeared around the corner, Penelope flew to her room. She changed into her better dress, the blue calico with the small white flowers, and pinned her hair as neatly as she could manage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped out the back door and made her way quickly through the side streets toward the mercantile. The store was busy with the usual Saturday crowd of ranchers and farmers coming to town for supplies. Penelope hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What if he was not here? What if he had forgotten? What if he had just been being polite and had never intended to actually meet her? Then she saw him. Zachary stood near the back of the store, examining some rope, his hat pushed back on his head. He looked up as if sensing her presence, and his whole face lit up with such genuine pleasure that all her doubts evaporated. He made his way through the crowd to her side. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice as if he had been as uncertain as she was. "I came," she agreed, unable to stop smiling. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. "I need to stop by the feed store, and then I thought maybe we could get some lemonade at the hotel restaurant if you have time." It was bold, bordering on scandalous, but Penelope found she did not care. "I have a little time," she said. They walked side by side down the wooden sidewalk, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed, sending little sparks of awareness through Penelope every time it happened. Zachary talked easily about the ranch, about the horses he worked with, about the vast Montana sky and how different it was from the Texas panhandle where he had grown up. "Why did you leave Texas?" Penelope asked. Zachary's expression grew more serious. "My father and I did not see eye to eye on much of anything. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps, take over his freight business, marry the daughter of his business partner. I wanted to work with horses, make my own way. We had words and I left. Figured I would rather be poor and free than comfortable and trapped." Penelope understood that sentiment more than he could know. "Do you regret it?" "Not for a single day," Zachary said firmly. "What about you?" "You have always lived here, all my life," Penelope confirmed. "It was good when my parents were alive. My father ran the telegraph office and my mother took in sewing. We were happy. Then the fever came and everything changed." "And your aunt?" Penelope's jaw tightened. "She is my father's older sister. She came to take charge of me, as she puts it. She believes women should be quiet, obedient, and completely without independence. I am a constant disappointment to her." "You are not a disappointment," Zachary said with surprising intensity. "You are strong and brave and beautiful, and anyone who treats you otherwise is a fool." Penelope stopped walking and turned to face him fully. People moved around them on the sidewalk, but she barely noticed. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Zachary said. "I know you could have run away when I offered to help you, but you took a chance. I know you came here today even though it probably was not easy. I know you have kind eyes and a smile that makes my heart beat faster. That is enough for now." No one had ever spoken to her like this. Penelope felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to step off into empty air. "Zachary," she said softly. "I know it is fast," he said quickly. "I know I should probably be more proper about this, but I cannot help it. I have thought about you every day since we met. I want to know you better. I want to spend time with you, talk to you, make you smile. Is that wrong?" "No," Penelope said, and she felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "It is not wrong at all." His smile could have lit up the entire territory. "Then let us get that lemonade." They spent an hour at the hotel restaurant, tucked at a corner table where they could talk relatively privately. Zachary told her about breaking horses, about sleeping under the stars, about the first time he had seen Montana and known this was where he belonged. Penelope told him about learning to shoot when she was 12, about reading every book she could get her hands on, about dreams of traveling and seeing something beyond these dusty streets. "What would you see?" Zachary asked. "If you could go anywhere." "The ocean," Penelope said without hesitation. "I want to stand on the shore and watch the waves roll in and know that there is a whole world out there beyond what I have known." "I have seen it," Zachary said. Went down to Galveston once as a boy. It is everything you imagine and more." He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Maybe someday I could take you there." It was a promise and a question wrapped together. Penelope felt her breath catch. "I would like that." Time passed too quickly, as it always does when you wish it would not. Eventually, Penelope had to admit that she needed to get back before her aunt returned home. Zachary walked her as far as he dared, stopping at the corner 2 streets from her house. "When can I see you again?" he asked. "I do not know," Penelope said honestly. "My aunt watches me closely. Today was only possible because she had her meeting." "Sunday," Zachary said suddenly. "Does your aunt make you go to church?" "Every Sunday without fail." "Then I will be there tomorrow," Zachary declared. "I can sit where you can see me, and at least we will be in the same room." Penelope laughed despite the ache in her chest at having to leave him. "You would endure Reverend Patterson's sermons just to see me." "I would endure far worse than that," Zachary said seriously. Then, after glancing around to make sure they were not observed, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Until tomorrow, Penelope." She walked home in a daze, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. The mending basket sat exactly where she had left it, and she threw herself into the work with nervous energy, finishing everything before Aunt Gertrude returned. That evening at supper, her aunt studied her across the table with narrowed eyes. "You seem different today," she observed. "Do I?" Penelope asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "More cheerful. I do not trust it." Gertrude set down her fork. "You have not been sneaking around behind my back, have you?" "I have been right here doing the mending exactly as you instructed," Penelope said. It was technically true, for most of the morning anyway. Gertrude did not look convinced, but she returned to her meal without further comment. Sunday morning, Penelope took extra care with her appearance, wearing her best dress and making sure her short hair was pinned and arranged as neatly as possible. Aunt Gertrude raised an eyebrow but said nothing as they walked to the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street. The church was already half full when they arrived, and Penelope's eyes scanned the pews automatically. At first, she did not see him, and disappointment settled heavy in her stomach. Then there was movement near the back, and Zachary stood briefly to catch her attention before sitting back down. He had cleaned up, wearing what was obviously his best shirt and a string tie, his dark hair neatly combed. When their eyes met, he smiled, and Penelope felt warmth flood through her entire body. The service passed in a blur. Penelope stood when everyone else stood, sang when everyone else sang, but she could not have repeated a single word of Reverend Patterson's sermon if her life had depended on it. All her awareness was focused on Zachary, sitting several rows back, his presence a comforting weight even though they could not speak or touch. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright morning sunshine, Zachary positioned himself near the church steps. He tipped his hat politely to Aunt Gertrude. "Morning, madam." Gertrude's eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "Do I know you?" "Zachary Zinc, madam. I work at the Double Z Ranch. I have seen you in town a few times." He turned to Penelope, his expression perfectly polite and proper. "Good morning, Miss Zimmerman." "Good morning, Mr. Zinc," Penelope replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "That was a fine sermon today," Zachary continued, addressing Gertrude again. "Reverend Patterson surely has a gift for speaking the Lord's word." Despite herself, Gertrude seemed slightly mollified by his respectful manner. "Yes, well, he does his best to guide his flock." Other churchgoers were filtering past, and Zachary stepped aside to let them through, effectively ending the brief conversation. But as Penelope walked away with her aunt, She glanced back to find him watching her, and the look in his eyes promised that this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, a careful dance began. Zachary came to church every Sunday, always positioning himself where Penelope could see him. He started coming into town more frequently on errands, and sometimes he would happen to be passing by when Penelope was walking to the mercantile or the post office. They would exchange brief greetings, nothing that could be considered improper, but each encounter was precious. Then one afternoon in early August, opportunity presented itself. Aunt Gertrude received word that her friend Mrs. Appleton in Silver Bow, a town about 30 miles away, had taken ill. Gertrude announced she would be traveling there to help care for her friend and would be gone for at least 3 days. "You will stay here and maintain the house," she instructed Penelope. "I expect everything to be in perfect order when I return. Mrs. Henderson has agreed to check on you each evening to ensure you are managing properly." "Yes, Aunt," Penelope said, trying not to let her excitement show. The morning after Gertrude's departure, Penelope was sweeping the front porch when she heard the sound of horse hooves. She looked up to see Zachary riding down her street, and her heart leaped into her throat. He dismounted and approached the porch, his hat in his hands. "I heard your aunt left town," he said without preamble. "Figured you might like some company if that would be all right." "More than all right," Penelope said, unable to contain her smile. They spent the afternoon sitting on the porch, talking like they had been friends for years instead of weeks. Zachary told her about his dreams of one day owning his own ranch, a small spread where he could breed quality horses. Penelope confessed her fear that she would be trapped in this house, under her aunt's thumb for the rest of her life. "Come with me," Zachary said suddenly. Penelope blinked. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated, setting down the glass of water she had brought him and taking both her hands in his. "Marry me, Penelope. I know it is fast, I know we have not known each other long, but I am sure of this. I am sure of you. We could build a life together, a good life, where you would be free and safe and loved." Penelope's mind reeled. "Zachary, I cannot just leave. My aunt would never allow it." "You are 21 years old," Zachary pointed out. "You do not need her permission. I am not asking you to run away in the night. I am asking you to marry me properly, publicly, and come be my wife." "She would be furious," Penelope whispered, but even as she said it, she felt hope rising in her chest. "Let her be furious," Zachary said fiercely. "You deserve to be happy, Penelope. You deserve to live your own life, not the one she has decided you should have. I cannot promise you riches or an easy road, but I can promise that I will work hard every day to make you smile. I will never raise my hand to you, or cut your hair as punishment, or tell you that you are anything less than extraordinary. I will love you with everything I have until the day I die." Tears were streaming down Penelope's face now. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Zachary let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently, reverently, like she was something precious and irreplaceable. "We should do it soon," Penelope said when they finally broke apart. "Before she gets back, before she can try to stop it." "Tomorrow," Zachary declared. "We will go to Reverend Patterson tomorrow and have him marry us. I will get a room for you at the hotel until we can make arrangements, so everything stays proper." The next morning, Penelope dressed in her mother's wedding dress, which she had kept carefully preserved in a trunk. It was simple but elegant, made of cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her short hair was carefully arranged with small white flowers tucked behind her ear. Zachary was waiting for her at the church, wearing his best clothes and holding a bouquet of wildflowers he must have picked that morning. His eyes widened when he saw her. You look like an angel, he breathed. Reverend Patterson seemed uncertain about the hasty wedding, but he knew Penelope's situation and could see the love evident between the young couple. He agreed to perform the ceremony with Mrs. Henderson and her husband standing as witnesses. Do you, Zachary Zinc, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Zachary said clearly, his eyes never leaving Penelope's face. And do you, Penelope Zimmerman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Penelope said, her voice strong and sure. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Zachary's kiss was gentle but full of promise. When they broke apart, Penelope was officially Penelope Zink, and the relief and joy she felt were almost overwhelming. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, in a room Zachary had rented that overlooked the main street. He was gentle with her, patient and loving, and when Penelope finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt safer and happier than she had in 3 long years. The next morning, they went to Aunt Gertrude's house together. Penelope packed her few belongings while Zachary loaded them onto a wagon he had borrowed from the ranch. She left a letter for her aunt explaining what she had done and why, though she suspected Gertrude would never understand or forgive. The Double Z Ranch was everything Zachary had described. The main house was a sprawling structure made of logs and stone, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Mr. Rutherford, the owner, was a gruff but fair man in his 50s who congratulated Zachary on his marriage and showed them to a small cabin on the property where the married hands lived. It was not much, just 2 rooms with a potbelly stove and simple furnishings, but to Penelope, it was paradise. For the first time in her life, she had a space that was truly hers, where she made the rules and decided how things would be. She threw herself into making the cabin a home, sewing curtains from fabric she bought with money she earned doing laundry for some of the other ranch hands. She planted a small garden and learned to cook the hearty meals that Zachary needed to keep his strength up for his demanding work. In the evenings, they would sit on the small porch of their cabin and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Zachary would tell her about his day, and she would share her own small triumphs and challenges. They talked about their future, about the ranch they would build one day, about children they might have. I was thinking maybe we could call it the Zink Ranch, Zachary mused one evening, his arm around Penelope's shoulders. Simple and straightforward. Or maybe the Wildflower Ranch, Penelope suggested. After the flowers you brought me on our wedding day, Zachary grinned. I like that. The Wildflower Ranch it is. 3 weeks after their wedding, Aunt Gertrude came to the ranch. Penelope saw her aunt's buggy coming up the drive and felt her stomach clench with old, familiar dread. But Zachary appeared at her side immediately, taking her hand. We face this together, he said quietly. She cannot hurt you any more. Gertrude climbed down from the buggy, her face rigid with anger. So it is true, she said, looking Penelope up and down. You married this cowboy and ran off like a common tramp. I married the man I love, Penelope corrected, keeping her voice calm, and I am happier than I have ever been. Happy? Gertrude spat the word like it was poison. You threw away every opportunity for a respectable life. I tried to raise you properly, teach you discipline and obedience, and this is how you repay me. You did not raise me, Penelope said, and she felt Zachary squeeze her hand encouragingly. You tried to break me. There is a difference. I provided for you after your parents died, Gertrude insisted. I gave you food and shelter when you had nothing. And I am grateful for that, Penelope said. Truly I am, but gratitude does not mean I owe you my entire life. I am an adult, Aunt Gertrude, and I have made my choice. A choice you will regret, Gertrude predicted darkly. Mark my words, girl, this will end badly for you. Maybe it will, Penelope allowed, but it will be my mistake to make, my life to live. You cannot control me any more. For a long moment, Gertrude stared at her, and Penelope could see the exact moment when her aunt realized she had truly lost. The older woman's face twisted with something that might have been grief or anger or both. You are no niece of mine, Gertrude said finally. Do not come crawling back to me when this falls apart. I will not, Penelope promised. Gertrude climbed back into her buggy and drove away without another word. Penelope watched her go, and she felt something release in her chest, some old knot of fear and obligation finally coming untied. Are you all right? Zachary asked quietly. Penelope turned to look at him, this man who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to help her, who had loved her despite knowing her for such a short time, who stood beside her now with unwavering support. I am better than all right, she said. I am free. The months passed quickly as summer faded into autumn. Penelope grew more confident in her role as a ranch wife, making friends with the other women on the property and in town. Her hair grew longer, reaching past her shoulders again, but she found she liked it better at the shorter length Zachary had cut it to. It felt more like her somehow, less like the dutiful niece she had been forced to be and more like the independent woman she was becoming. In October, she realized she had missed her monthly courses twice in a row. She told Zachary one evening after supper, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. His eyes went wide with wonder. A baby, he said softly. We are going to have a baby. Penelope nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes. Are you happy about it? Zachary crossed the cabin in 2 long strides and gathered her into his arms. Happy does not even begin to cover it, he murmured into her hair. You have given me so much, Penelope. A home, a purpose, a reason to be better than I ever thought I could be. And now this. I am the luckiest man alive. They told Mr. Rutherford the next day, and the ranch owner was genuinely pleased for them. He even offered to let them move into a slightly larger cabin that had just become available when an older couple retired and moved to town. The new cabin had 3 rooms instead of 2, with space for a nursery and a real kitchen instead of just a cooking corner. Penelope spent weeks getting it ready, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, while Zachary built a cradle from pine wood that he sanded until it was smooth as silk. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in thick white curtains by mid-November. Penelope's belly grew round, and she found she had to move more carefully, had to rest more often. Zachary was endlessly patient, taking over more of the household chores without complaint, making sure she stayed warm and comfortable. On a freezing night in late February, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, with Mrs. Rutherford and 2 other ranch wives attending her. Zachary paced outside the cabin for hours, wearing a path in the snow, until finally he heard the thin wail of a newborn. Mrs. Rutherford opened the door with a weary smile. You have a son, she announced, and your wife is asking for you. Zachary entered the cabin to find Penelope propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the blue blanket she had made. Zachary, meet your son, she said softly. Zachary approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the small, red-faced infant in his wife's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, mewling sounds. Something in Zachary's chest cracked open, a feeling so intense it was almost painful. He is perfect, Zachary whispered. What should we call him? I was thinking James, Penelope said. After my father. James Zinc, Zachary said, testing the name. I like it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little man. The baby seemed to settle at the sound of his father's voice, his tiny fist curling around Zachary's finger when it was offered. Zachary looked at his wife and son, and he thought about the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. If Penelope's aunt had not punished her, if he had not stopped at that creek, if either of them had been less brave, none of this would exist. "Thank you," he said to Penelope, his voice rough with emotion. "For what?" she asked. "For saying yes. For taking a chance on me. For giving me this life." He leaned down and kissed her gently. "I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of it." "You already are," Penelope assured him. "More than you know." The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. James was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Zachary would sit for hours just watching him sleep, marveling at this tiny person they had created. Spring came, and with it, planting season. Penelope put James in a sling against her chest and worked in her garden, talking to him about the different plants as she worked. Zachary took on extra responsibilities at the ranch, determined to save as much money as possible toward their dream of owning their own land. One evening in late May, Mr. Rutherford called Zachary to the main house. Penelope watched her husband walk up the path with curiosity, wondering what the summons might be about. Zachary returned an hour later with a strange expression on his face, somewhere between shocked and elated. "Mr. Rutherford wants to retire," he announced without preamble. "His daughter back east is expecting her first child, and he wants to be there to help her. He is selling the ranch." Penelope's heart sank. "We will have to find somewhere else to live, or we could buy it," Zachary said slowly. "Not the whole ranch, but he is willing to split off a section. 500 acres with water rights and some of the best grazing land. He would sell it to us for a fair price, and he would let us pay over time." 500 acres, Penelope breathed. "That is more than we ever talked about." "I know. It is a lot to take on. We would have to work hard, probably hire some help eventually, but Penelope, we could do it. We could build the Wildflower Ranch for real." Penelope looked at her husband, at the hope and excitement in his eyes, and then down at their son sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "Let us do it," she decided. "Let us build something for James, something that will last." The paperwork took several weeks to finalize, but by midsummer they were officially landowners. Mr. Rutherford stayed on for a few months to help with the transition, teaching Zachary the business side of ranching that he had not been exposed to as a hired hand. They started with cattle, a small herd that Zachary bought from a neighboring rancher who was downsizing. Penelope learned to keep the books, recording expenses and income with meticulous care. Money was tight at first, and there were weeks when they survived on beans and bread, but they were happy. They were building something together, and every small success felt like a victory. By the time James celebrated his first birthday, the Wildflower Ranch was starting to show real promise. They had increased their herd, built additional corrals, and hired 2 hands to help with the work. Penelope had expanded her garden and was selling excess produce in town, adding to their income. One afternoon in early autumn, Penelope was hanging laundry when she heard a buggy approaching. She shaded her eyes against the sun and was surprised to see Mrs. Henderson from town climbing down. "Mrs. Henderson," Penelope greeted her warmly. "What brings you all the way out here?" The older woman looked uncomfortable. "I have news, my dear, and I wanted you to hear it from a friend rather than through gossip." Penelope felt a chill run through her. "What is it?" "It is your aunt, Mrs. Henderson said gently. "Gertrude Zimmerman passed away 3 days ago. Apoplexy, the doctor said. It was very sudden." Penelope stood very still, trying to process this information. She had not seen or spoken to her aunt since that confrontation over a year ago. "I see," she said finally. "There is more," Mrs. Henderson continued. "She left a will. You are her sole heir. The house, her savings, everything comes to you." "I do not want it," Penelope said immediately. "I understand how you feel," Mrs. Henderson said, "but perhaps you should not decide so quickly. The house could be sold, the money used for your ranch or for young James's future. It is not insignificant." Penelope thought about it. Her first instinct was to refuse anything from the woman who had made her so miserable, but Mrs. Henderson had a point. This was not about Gertrude anymore. This was about providing for her family. "I will discuss it with Zachary," she said finally. That evening, after James was asleep, Penelope told her husband about Mrs. Henderson's visit. Zachary listened quietly, then pulled her into his arms. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Conflicted," Penelope admitted. "Part of me wants nothing to do with anything connected to her. But another part thinks about what that money could mean for us, for James, for this ranch." "Then we take it," Zachary said decisively. "We take it and we use it to build the life she tried to keep you from having. That seems like the best possible revenge, if revenge is even what you want." Penelope smiled despite herself. "When did you get so wise?" "I married a smart woman," Zachary said, kissing the top of her head. "Some of it must have rubbed off. In the end, they sold Aunt Gertrude's house and used the money to expand the ranch significantly. They bought more land, built a proper ranch house to replace their cabin, and purchased breeding stock for what would become Zachary's dream of raising quality horses alongside their cattle operation. The years that followed were busy and challenging but deeply fulfilling. Penelope gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Emma, who had her father's blue eyes, and another son they called Daniel, who looked exactly like his older brother. The ranch prospered, gaining a reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Zachary surprised Penelope with a trip. They left the children with Mrs. Rutherford, who had stayed in the area after her husband sold the ranch, and took the train west. "Where are we going?" Penelope asked, trying to contain her excitement. "You will see," was all Zachary would say. 2 days later, they stood on a beach in California, watching the Pacific Ocean roll endlessly toward the shore. The water was gray-green and vast, stretching to the horizon in every direction. Penelope had tears streaming down her face as she felt the spray on her skin and listened to the roar of the waves. "You said you wanted to see the ocean," Zachary reminded her, his arm around her waist. "I promised I would take you someday." "It is more beautiful than I imagined," Penelope said, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you. For this, for everything, for choosing me that day at the creek." "I would choose you every day for the rest of my life," Zachary said seriously. "You are my heart, Penelope. You and our children and the life we have built together. I could not imagine anything better." They stayed in California for a week, walking on the beach, exploring the small coastal town, and simply enjoying being together without the constant demands of the ranch. It was a gift neither of them had realized they needed, this time to reconnect and remember why they had fallen in love in the first place. When they returned home, it was to chaos. Daniel had caught a cold that had turned into croup, and Mrs. Rutherford had been up for 2 nights straight trying to keep his fever down. They dove immediately back into the demands of parenthood and ranching, but they both carried that week with them like a talisman, proof that there was a world beyond their daily responsibilities, and that they could still find magic in it together. The children grew. James became a serious boy who loved working with his father, learning everything he could about horses and cattle. Emma was wild and free, climbing trees and racing her brothers, refusing to be confined by expectations of how little girls should behave. Daniel was the quiet one, always with his nose in a book, dreaming of far-off places. Penelope's hair grew long again over the years, but she never wore it in a braid. Instead, she kept it loose or pinned up in a simple bun, and every time she caught her reflection, she remembered that day at the creek when everything changed. When James turned 16, Zachary sat him down for a serious conversation. "You are old enough now to make your own choices," he told his son. "You can stay here and work the ranch with me, or you can go find your own path. I will support you either way." James looked surprised. "You would let me leave?" "I would not let you do anything," Zachary corrected gently. "You are nearly a man. You get to decide your own life. That is what freedom means." James thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "I want to stay. I want to keep building what you and Mother started, but I appreciate you asking instead of just assuming." Zachary felt pride swell in his chest. "Then we will build it together, you and I." They had the same conversation with Emma when she turned 16, and true to form, she chose a different path. She wanted to become a teacher, to open a school right there on their land for the children of the ranch families and surrounding farms. "People told me I could not do it because I am a girl," Emma said fiercely. "But Mother has taught me that women can be whatever they decide to be, and I have decided to be a teacher." Penelope hugged her daughter tight, tears in her eyes. "Then that is exactly what you will be." They helped Emma build a small schoolhouse on a corner of their property, and within a year, she had 15 students of varying ages. Penelope would sometimes stop by to watch her daughter teach, amazed at the confident, passionate young woman she had become. Daniel chose to leave when he turned 18, heading east to study at a university. It was hard to see him go, but Penelope and Zachary had given their children what they had fought so hard to gain for themselves: the freedom to choose their own paths. The ranch continued to thrive. Zachary's reputation as a horseman spread throughout the territory, and people came from hundreds of miles away to purchase his breeding stock. Penelope became known for her hospitality, hosting dinners and gatherings that brought the ranching community together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. The barn was decorated with wildflowers and ribbons, and what seemed like half the territory showed up to celebrate. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and when Zachary took Penelope's hand and led her onto the makeshift dance floor, everyone fell back to give them space. 20 years, Zachary marveled as they swayed to the music. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you at that creek." "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago," Penelope countered. "Like that girl was someone else entirely." "She was brave enough to take a chance on a wandering cowboy," Zachary said. "I will always be grateful to her for that." "And I will always be grateful to that cowboy for seeing me," Penelope replied. "For seeing past the punishment and shame to the person underneath." They danced until the stars came out, surrounded by the family and community they had built together. Later, lying in bed in the ranch house they had designed together, Zachary traced idle patterns on Penelope's arm. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving your aunt, marrying me so quickly, all of it?" "Not once," Penelope said firmly. "Not for a single moment." "You gave me my life back, Zachary. You gave me myself." "You did that," Zachary corrected. "I just helped a little. You were always strong, always brave. I just gave you a reason to show it." The years continued their steady march forward. James married a woman from a neighboring ranch, and soon there were grandchildren running through the house. Emma fell in love with a young lawyer who came through town and followed him to Helena, where she opened a school for girls. Daniel eventually returned from his studies and became a writer, documenting the history and stories of the Montana Territory. Penelope and Zachary grew older together, their hair turning silver, their bodies moving more slowly, but their love never diminishing. They sat on the porch of their ranch house most evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day, just as they had done in their little cabin all those years ago. One evening, when Penelope was 65 and Zachary was 69, they sat together as usual, her head resting on his shoulder. Their oldest grandson was running the ranch now, with James serving as an advisor, and the Wildflower Ranch was more prosperous than they had ever dreamed it could be. "We did good, did we not?" Zachary said softly. "We did very good," Penelope agreed. "3 children, all happy and successful, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a ranch that will provide for them long after we are gone. I would say we exceeded all expectations." "I meant with us," Zachary clarified. "You and me. We did good together." Penelope lifted her head to look at him, seeing the lines on his face, the silver in his hair, but also seeing the young man who had offered her kindness when she needed it most. "We did excellent together," she said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Zachary Zinc." "That is funny," Zachary said with a smile. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." They kissed, a gentle press of lips that held decades of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they pulled apart, Penelope settled back against his shoulder, and they watched the sun sink below the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Their story had started with cruelty and ended with love. It had started with loss and ended with abundance. It had started with a young woman whose hair was chopped as punishment and a cowboy who saw her beauty anyway. And in between, they had built a life worth living, a love worth having, and a legacy worth leaving behind. As darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, Zachary squeezed Penelope's hand gently. "Ready to head inside?" he asked. "In a minute," Penelope said. "I just want to enjoy this a little longer." So they sat together in the Montana twilight, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and held on tight through everything life threw at them. They had loved deeply and lived fully, and when the time came for them to leave this world, they did so knowing that they had created something beautiful together. The Wildflower Ranch continued for generations after them, a testament to what could be built when 2 people chose love over fear, courage over comfort, and freedom over everything else. And somewhere in the family stories passed down through the years was the tale of how it all began, with scissors and kindness and a cowboy who looked at a punished woman and saw only beauty. Their love story became legend in Montana Territory, told and retold at gatherings and family dinners. Young couples would visit the original cabin, now preserved as a historical site on the ranch property, and marvel at how something so grand could begin in such a small space. The creek where they first met became known as Zimmerman Creek, and people would sometimes leave wildflowers there in honor of the ranch and the love story that had started on its banks. Emma wrote down her parents' story in her later years, creating a detailed account that was eventually published and read throughout the West. Zachary lived to be 73, passing peacefully in his sleep with Penelope beside him. She followed him 2 years later, having refused to leave the ranch she had helped build even when her children begged her to move to town where she would be closer to doctors. She died in the same bedroom where she had given birth to all 3 of her children, looking out the window at the mountains she loved. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large oak tree that Zachary had planted the year James was born. Their headstone was simple, just their names and dates, but at the bottom was inscribed, "They chose love, and love chose them back." Daniel wrote a poem for their memorial service that captured the essence of who they had been. It spoke of courage and kindness, of a young woman punished and a young man who saw beauty where others saw shame. It spoke of building dreams together and raising children to be free. It spoke of love that lasted decades and legacy that would last centuries. The Wildflower Ranch stood for over 100 years, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in Montana. The descendants of Penelope and Zachary Zinc continued to run it, each generation adding their own touches while honoring the foundation that had been laid by the couple who started it all. Visitors to the ranch could still see reminders of that original love story everywhere. The cabin where they lived in those early years. The cradle Zachary built for James, preserved in the ranch museum. The garden plot where Penelope had grown her vegetables, now a formal garden maintained by family members. The barn where they held their 20th anniversary party. But perhaps the most enduring reminder was in the family itself. The Zink descendants carried forward the values Penelope and Zachary had lived by. Courage to choose your own path, kindness toward those who need it, and the understanding that love is always worth fighting for. Young Zink daughters were told the story of their great-great-grandmother, whose hair was cut as punishment but who found freedom anyway. They learned that appearances do not define you, that cruelty does not have to break you, and that sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best ones. Young Zink sons were told about their great-great-grandfather who saw past surfaces to the person beneath, who chose compassion over judgment, and who built an empire not through force but through love and hard work. They learned that real strength lies in gentleness, that true power comes from lifting others up, and that the best legacy you can leave is a family that loves each other. The story of Penelope and Zachary became more than just family history. It became a reminder of what was possible when two people refused to let circumstances define them. When a woman punished for speaking to a stranger chose to trust that stranger with her future. When a cowboy who could have ridden past decided to stop and help. When love was given a chance to grow even in the hardest soil. Their great-grandchildren would sometimes sit on that same porch where Penelope and Zachary had spent so many evenings, looking out at land that had been shaped by their ancestors' dreams. They would think about how different things might have been if Zachary had not stopped at that creek, if Penelope had not accepted his help, if either of them had chosen fear over hope. But they did not choose fear. They chose each other, and in doing so, they created something that outlasted them both. A family. A home. A love story that would be told for generations. And a ranch that stood as proof that beauty can come from pain, that kindness can change everything, and that true love really does conquer all. The wildflowers that grew on their grave bloomed every spring without fail, bright splashes of color that could be seen from the house. Family members would pick them sometimes, bringing them inside to decorate the ranch house. And in those moments, it felt like Penelope and Zachary were still there, still part of the daily life of the place they had built together. On summer evenings, when the wind blew just right through the valley, you could almost hear it whispering their story. The girl whose hair was chopped as punishment, the cowboy who saw her beauty anyway, the love that grew from a single act of kindness, the life they built together against all odds, the legacy that lived on long after they were gone. And somewhere in the stars above the Montana mountains, perhaps two souls still sat together, watching over the land they loved and the family they created, content in the knowledge that their story would never truly end as long as there were wildflowers blooming and people willing to believe in the power of love. Their story had taught generations that sometimes the worst days lead to the best outcomes, that judgment and punishment cannot destroy the human spirit, and that a single moment of kindness can ripple outward through time in ways we cannot imagine. Penelope and Zachary Zinc had started with nothing but each other and built everything that mattered. In the end, that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.